Previously, in Ohio, a mother spent 9 years presenting her healthy son Caleb as gravely ill, collecting the community's sympathy and hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations. A hidden hospital camera exposed the truth. But midway through the trial, the prosecution revealed another shattering name. Renee's 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, had been pulled into the same darkness. With that news, the room understood the case was far from over. One camera can expose a truth, but a second camera sometimes stands far closer than the first. And this time, the person behind the lens was someone no one expected. In this part, the Franklin County courtroom would question not only one mother, but where an entire family had stood in the silence. Because sometimes a crime is the work not only of one hand, but of eyes that chose not to look. When the room reconvened, Castellan brought a small box to the stand. Inside it, a small home security camera. "Your Honor," she said, "this camera was installed in the Callahan children's bedroom 8 months ago, and the person who installed it was not the defendant herself." The room lost its breath for a second time at that sentence. On the morning this part began, the crowd outside the courthouse was even larger than before, because news that Peter Callahan had installed a camera had already leaked into the morning broadcasts. The room inside had become not merely an audience to a trial, but a community watching a family's secrets unravel, layer by layer. Everyone in the room was asking the same question. Then who? Castellan did not give the answer right away. First, she submitted the device's technical records to the court. The camera's cloud account was linked to an email address, peter.callahan1981@gmail.com. A murmur rose through the room. In the back rows, Peter Callahan covered his face with his hands. Castellan continued with resolve. Mr. Callahan began an 8-month period of surveillance in his own children's bedroom, which means the very man sitting here today, accusing his wife, had in fact known what was happening inside his own home for 8 months. That sentence instantly reversed the way everyone in the room had been viewing Peter. Moments ago you had seen a broken, helpless father. Now you saw a man who had chosen, for 8 months, to remain silent. The audience's conscience took the first major blow of this part, and this time the target was the most sympathetic figure in the entire case. In the gallery, a donor's voice rose. Did he know too? Kessler questioned whether this new evidence too had been properly obtained. Your Honor, doesn't a spouse installing a camera in a shared living space without the other spouse's knowledge constitute a privacy violation? After brief research, Judge Lindquist answered, under Ohio law, a parent may install a reasonable monitoring device in a shared living space for the purpose of safeguarding their own child's safety. This recording is admissible. That ruling widened the case's evidentiary ground once again. Detective Laura Bennett took the stand for a second time, this time regarding the forensic analysis of the footage obtained from Peter's camera. We reviewed 8 months of recordings, she said, her voice still flat and factual. In total, we identified 11 separate incidents in which the defendant added a substance to the children's food or drink. 8 of those incidents involved Sophie. 3 involved Caleb while he was still at home. Bennett presented a timeline. In the first month of recording, incidents were sparse, once a month. But over the last 2 months, the frequency had increased, twice a week. This increase, Bennett said, coincides with the period when Caleb's hospital records began being questioned. It appears as though, as control over one child weakened, the focus shifted more intensely toward the other. As a last resort, Kessler questioned the digital integrity of the footage. Detective Bennett, are you certain this footage was never interrupted, never edited in any way? Bennett answered with calm certainty. The footage was examined by an independent digital forensics laboratory, Mr. Kessler. No interruption or editing was found. The timestamps match precisely with the device manufacturer's own servers. That technical verification made the case's evidentiary foundation now unshakable. Once again, the room recognized that 2 different cameras, at 2 different times, had caught 2 different children bearing witness to the same truth. A pattern too consistent to be coincidence had become an undeniable fact. As she stepped down from the stand, Bennett added one final sentence, outside her formal testimony, but one that would remain in the room's memory for a long time. In 11 years on the job, I have never seen a case unfold in plain sight, in front of so many people, for so long. Sometimes the darkest truths hide in the brightest places. When Peter was called back to the stand, his steps were heavier still. "Why did you install the camera, Mr. Callahan?" Castellan asked. After a long silence, Peter answered, "Because one night Sophie told me her stomach hurt because of what Mum gave her. And because I couldn't believe what I was seeing, I thought I needed to see it with my own eyes." Peter continued. 2 weeks after installing the camera, the footage showed Renee mixing a powder into Sophie's food. "In that moment," he said, his voice breaking, "I should have gone to the police, but I didn't. Because I knew that if I did, my entire life would collapse, and I was terrified of that collapse." Castellan asked, "Mr. Callahan, after seeing that footage, how many more times did you watch your wife give something to your daughter?" Peter's voice was almost inaudible. 6 times. The room fell completely silent at that number. A father had watched his own daughter being harmed 6 times and had done nothing. Before finishing, Peter added one final sentence. "I too am part of this family. I too, through my silence, allowed it to happen. Whether that is a crime is for you to decide, but in my own conscience, I decided long ago." That confession made clear, once again, that the case was no longer searching for a single guilty party, but questioning the collective silence of an entire family. Kessler tried to turn that confession into an opportunity. He rose. "Your Honor, the state places my client at the center of this case, but the state's own witness has just confessed to remaining silent for 8 months, watching 6 times and doing nothing. If someone truly bears responsibility here, that responsibility does not belong to one person alone." Castellan answered without raising her voice, "Mr. Kessler, one person's complicity does not diminish another's guilt. Mr. Callahan's silence may be the subject of a separate charge, and in fact, the state has opened an investigation into him as well. But that does not mean the defendant did not put something harmful into her daughter's food." With that clarity, the room understood the case would now proceed on 2 fronts at once. That news created a new wave of shock in the room. Peter Callahan was no longer merely a witness, but a potential defendant himself. Judge Lindquist made a brief procedural note, reminding Peter that he needed to retain his own counsel and that anything he said from this point forward could be used against him. Peter accepted that warning without a single objection. As Renee, at the defense table, listened to her husband's confession, for the first time a genuine emotion crossed her face, but it was not remorse. In her eyes was a strange glint of satisfaction, as though saying, "You're not so clean either." That expression did not escape the notice of at least 2 jury members, and they wrote something down in their notebooks. Though only a few people noticed that expression in the moment, it was later captured by a journalist's camera lens and carried onto the front page of the newspaper in the days that followed. The headline was brief but striking, "A Mother's Satisfaction." While some readers felt the headline was overly interpretive, those who had witnessed the moment firsthand in the courtroom confirmed that the photograph exaggerated nothing at all. Dr. Voss took the stand again, this time to describe Sophie's medical history. "Sophie's file carried nearly the same pattern as Caleb's," she said, "but at an earlier stage. 2 emergency room visits in the past 6 months, unexplained bouts of nausea, and, most concerning of all, an unexpected slowing in her growth." A forensic toxicologist, in brief testimony, confirmed that Sophie's most recent blood work showed traces of an over-the-counter laxative compound, at a concentration far beyond any dosage appropriate for a child's body. This, the expert said, does not indicate a single accident, but repeated exposure. As a last resort, Kessler asked, "Dr. Voss, could these findings not have resulted from something the child ingested on her own?" Voss answered calmly but firmly, "A 6-year-old child cannot, on her own, access a substance kept in a locked cabinet inside the home, Mr. Kessler. The forensic team already considered and ruled out that possibility. With that testimony, the room was forced to accept that this case was no longer a matter of misunderstanding or an overly anxious mother. Two children, two separate files, but a single pattern, and at the center of that pattern still sat the same woman, silent, at the defense table. A social services specialist presented the court with a brief comparative analysis. While Caleb's file showed a gradual escalation spread across 9 years, Sophie's file revealed the same pattern, advancing far more rapidly, in a far shorter span of time. It was as though, the specialist said, a learning process that took years with the first child was repeated far more quickly with the second. That observation gave rise to one of the case's most chilling implications. Had intervention not come, how much further might Sophie's path have gone? The prosecution called another unexpected name, Michelle Ortega, Renee's closest friend, who had managed the social media presence for the Caleb's Warriors charity campaign. When she took the stand, her voice was defensive. "I only shared the photos," she said. "I never saw the medical records. I simply trusted what Renee told me." Castellan placed a payment record on the stand. "Miss Ortega, records show you regularly received 10% of the campaign's revenue as a social media management fee, a total of $38,000. Was that simply payment for sharing photographs?" Michelle's face flushed. "It was an arrangement," she said, her voice weakening. "Renee proposed it. I agreed." Castellan continued. "And Miss Ortega, did you ever have suspicions? For instance, did you notice that some of Caleb's photographs didn't match the dates of his claimed surgeries?" After a long silence, Michelle admitted, "I asked once. Renee got angry at me, said, 'I thought you were my friend.' So I never asked again, because I didn't want to lose either my friendship or my income." That testimony added yet another dimension to the case. The silence surrounding Renee had been sustained not only by fear or belief, but sometimes by direct financial interest. Once again, the room silently tallied how many different people, for how many different reasons, had chosen to look away in order to keep a lie standing. Outside the courtroom, the Caleb's Warriors page collapsed within hours. 400,000 followers began leaving furious comments, one after another. Some demanded their donated money back. Others wrote of the shame they felt at their own naivety. The page was taken down entirely by its owner in the 3rd week of the trial, but the internet's memory did not erase so easily. A sociology professor at a local university described the case in the media as a trust crisis of the digital age. "People react to suffering so quickly," she said in one interview, "that they skip the step of verification entirely. This case is not just one mother's story. It is a mirror of what we, as a society, believe and why." A news channel interviewed another mother who had also raised donations for her own child's cancer treatment. "This case," the woman said through tears, "is also a disaster for families like ours who are genuinely in need. Now people will look at even real stories with suspicion. One woman's lie has cast a shadow over the credibility of hundreds of honest families." In the midst of this societal collapse, inside the courtroom itself, the case's most pivotal moment had not yet arrived. Renee had still not taken the stand, and defense attorney Kessler was quietly hinting that he still held one final card in reserve. An unexpected additional witness was called, the family's former nanny, 26-year-old Jenna Marsh. She had worked for the Callahan family for 2 years, but had left the job 6 months earlier for personal reasons. When she took the stand, her hands were trembling. "My reason for leaving wasn't personal," she said. "When Renee told me to give Sophie her medications at different hours than the doctor had prescribed, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer." Castellan asked, "Why did you never report this to anyone before now, Miss Marsh?" "Because who would have believed me? Renee was so beloved in the community. I was just a nanny. If I ever said anything against her, no one would have taken my side, and I probably would have been right." That answer surfaced, once again, perhaps the most recurring theme of the entire case. Someone who holds power and sympathy can easily silence the weakest voices around them. A nurse, a child, a nanny, all of them shared the same fear. No one will believe me. Jenna added one final detail. Before leaving, she had once confronted Renee about it. Renee's answer, her voice never once changing, had been, "You're not a mother, Jenna. You don't understand." When that sentence was read aloud in the room, many felt it was the most chilling line they had heard throughout the entire case, because it was not a confession, it was a conviction. The final card Kessler had hinted at holding turned out to be a request no one expected. The defense asked the court to admit a previously recorded video statement from 6-year-old Sophie, taken under the supervision of a child therapist, a recording in which the child said she still loved her mother and that everyone had misunderstood her. Castellan objected forcefully, but Judge Lindquist, under a special procedure designed to protect the child's welfare, permitted a limited portion of the recording to be viewed. In the recording, a small girl answered the therapist's questions hesitantly but sincerely. "I love my mum," Sophie said on screen. "I know she sometimes gave me something bad, but she's still my mum." As the room watched that footage, it was overcome by a sorrow deeper than anything felt at any other moment in the trial. Because here, there was neither guilty nor innocent, only the voice of a child trying to make sense of a complicated, broken love. Following the recording, the child therapist offered a brief clarification. Sophie's love for her mother is real, but that love does not invalidate the harm she experienced. Children can continue to love even a parent who has hurt them. That is the nature of attachment, not a measure of justice. That clarification helped everyone in the room place the footage they had just watched into its proper context. Kessler had tried to present that recording as proof that his client was not entirely a bad person, but its effect turned out differently than he had hoped. After that footage, the room did not turn away from anger toward Renee, but carried an anger now mixed with grief, because a child still defending the mother who had harmed her became recorded as one of the most tragic details of the entire case. As the trial progressed, Barbara Doyle requested, of her own accord, to take the stand once more. A rare request, but Judge Lindquist permitted it. "I need to say something," Barbara said, her voice trembling. 8 months ago, Peter called me. He told me his suspicions. I told him, maybe you're wrong, don't blame Renee too much. I was the one who encouraged him to stay silent. That confession expanded the scope of the case once more. Barbara had passed down to her daughter a lesson learned in her own childhood, the belief that illness earned attention, and had then, by suppressing her granddaughter's own husband's suspicions, extended that same chain of silence by one more link. "I too am part of this chain," Barbara said through tears. "Perhaps I am its oldest link." Following that confession, Judge Lindquist offered a rare personal observation. This court convened to judge one person. But this case has shown us that some wounds do not begin with a single individual. They pass silently, hand to hand, across generations. This court's task is to deliver a legal ruling, but this family's task will be to stop that chain here. Those words echoed through the room for a long while. As Barbara stepped down from the stand, she looked, for the first time, into her daughter's eyes, and for the first time, Renee did not look away. But what that exchanged look truly meant, the remainder of the case would reveal, because the court had not yet spoken its final word. When Renee was called to the stand for the final time, her former composure was gone. Castellan began her questioning with unexpected gentleness, almost like a therapist. "Miss Callahan, you heard your mother's testimony. Did you ever feel, in your own childhood, that being sick was the only way to receive attention?" Renee did not answer for a long moment. Then, for the first time, her voice broke completely. "Yes," she said, through tears. "My mother only took care of me when I was sick, only then. And maybe I taught Caleb and Sophie the only language of love I ever knew. I don't know. I don't know what's real anymore." That confession created the most complex moment of the entire case. For the first time, Renee was neither fully accepting responsibility for her actions, nor fully denying them. The audience's conscience staggered once more. this time toward neither innocence nor guilt, but toward a deep, unresolved human complexity. Without ever raising her voice, Castellan asked her final question. Ms. Callahan, I understand the pain of your childhood, but tell me one thing. When you put that powder into Sophie's food, did your hands tremble? After a long silence, Renee answered in a whisper, no, they didn't. The room froze completely at that answer. In the trial's final week, the prosecution called an independent healthcare policy expert, Dr. Farah Osei, to offer systemic testimony. 11 different hospitals, Osei said, shared no data with one another over 9 years. The reason was not malice. It was the complex structure of patient privacy laws that made cross-state data sharing difficult. Osei continued, this case is, in truth, proof that a well-intentioned law created a gap that could be exploited. Patient privacy must, of course, be protected. But a system that allows a child to be treated across 11 different institutions with no cross-checking in place leaves a door wide open to abuse. Castellan asked, Dr. Osei, what would you recommend to prevent the recurrence of cases like this one? Osei answered decisively, a cross-state, anonymized repeated treatment history alert system. When a child presents with similar symptoms across numerous different institutions within a short span of time, it should automatically trigger a review, just as prescription drug monitoring systems already do. That testimony made clear once again that the case was now questioning not only one family, but an entire healthcare system. But the room did not yet know that. Just before closing arguments, perhaps the most unexpected moment of the entire case, one final confession from Renee's own mouth still lay ahead of them. Before leaving the stand, Osei left the court with one brief final note. When this case closes, one woman will have been punished. But tomorrow, the system may still fail to hear another child's voice, unless we truly act on the lessons we have learned today. Those words left behind, in the room, a sense of responsibility reaching beyond the individual outcome of the case. In her closing argument, Castellan never once raised her voice. Your Honor, she said, a painful childhood is an explanation, not an excuse. For 9 years, Renee Callahan turned a child's body into an instrument of her own need. Then she repeated the same act with a second child. This was not a mistake. It was a choice, made again and again and again. Kessler spoke, lowering his voice. This court should not punish an illness. My client expressed her own pain in the most destructive form possible, yes, but this was not a calculated act of malice. It was a broken person, repeating a broken inheritance. Punishing her will not deliver true justice. It will only carry the cycle one generation further. As Judge Lindquist delivered her instructions to the jury, her voice was even. A person's past may explain their behavior, but this court must not confuse explanation with responsibility. I ask you to weigh the evidence independent of emotion. The jurors left the room with those words, carrying on their shoulders the weight of 9 years of deception. The jury retired to deliberate. This time, the room was forced to wait not for a single day, but for 4 full days. Those 4 days were proof of the case's complexity. Here, a simple verdict of guilty or not guilty no longer seemed sufficient. Throughout those 4 days, Renee sat in a small waiting room at the courthouse without her locket for the first time. One of the guards explained it as a standard pre-verdict security measure. But many observers felt that small detail also represented a kind of symbolic nakedness. The locket she had worn like armor for 9 years was no longer with her. What exactly happened inside the jury room would never be fully known, but after the trial, 2 jurors agreed to speak with a reporter on condition of anonymity. On the first vote, 1 juror said, 8 were for guilty, 4 were undecided. Those who were undecided had been moved by Renee's own confession about her childhood. For 4 days, inside the jury room, the same moral dilemma at the heart of the case played out again. On the second day, 1 juror had asked the others, if this is an illness, is it fair to punish it as a crime? Another had answered, but 2 children were genuinely harmed. The illness doesn't change the outcome. On the third day, the jury requested to reread the written statement of Sophie's school teacher, who had recounted that Sophie had said in class, "The medicine my mum gives me makes me sleepy. I don't want it, but I have to drink it." One juror said that after hearing that statement again, "I lost my uncertainty." On the fourth day, the vote reached unanimity. One juror added, at the end of the interview, "Reaching that verdict was the hardest decision I've ever made in my life, because I couldn't see Renee as a monster, but I also couldn't forget that fear in both children's eyes. Sometimes justice settles in a place that doesn't fully satisfy anyone." The jury foreperson recounted that, just before reading the verdict, she had looked once more at the other 11 members and had seen the same weary certainty in every one of their eyes. "No one was happy," she said, "but we all believed we had done what was right." Sometimes that's what justice is, not a triumph to celebrate, but simply a responsibility to carry. On the afternoon of the fourth day, when the jury foreperson rose, every breath in the room stopped at once. On the charge of aggravated child abuse, the foreperson said, "The jury finds the defendant guilty, with respect to both children." The room froze for an instant. On the charge of wire fraud, the jury finds the defendant guilty. As Renee listened to the verdict, she showed no reaction at all, no tears, no anger. She only raised her hand once more to the locket at her throat. It was the same gesture everyone in the room had seen since the beginning of the case, but no one believed any longer that it was a sign of love. Judge Lindquist remained silent for a moment before pronouncing sentence. "This court," she said, "is not punishing an illness, but a series of conscious choices built atop that illness. I am sentencing Miss Callahan to a total of 32 years in prison, calculated separately for the charges relating to each child. Parole may be considered no earlier than 18 years from now." In a separate hearing, Peter Callahan was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation and community service for child neglect. No prison time, but his name would never again be spoken, the way it had been before the case. A father would pay the price of his silence far more heavily in his own conscience than in any sentencing record. As he left the courtroom, Peter looked once more toward the spot where the empty wheelchair had stood. It had since been removed, but its trace still lingered on the floor like a faint shadow. Some marks, he told himself, are not erased by a court's ruling. One simply has to learn how to carry them. After the case ended, Caleb and Sophie Callahan began growing up under the supervision of their grandmother, Barbara Doyle, who had agreed to confront her own past within a monitored arrangement overseen by family court. Dr. Voss agreed to continue voluntary monthly check-ins. "Recovery," she said in one interview, "is not a straight line, but for the first time, these two children are learning to trust their own reality." Following the case, the Franklin County Health Board issued a new protocol requiring all hospitals statewide to use a centralized data-sharing system for cases involving repeated treatment histories across multiple institutions. Some commentators had already begun calling it the Callahan Protocol. At the same time, 3 major donation platforms voluntarily adopted a third-party verification requirement for medical fundraising campaigns. But these changes did not bring back the 9 years Caleb and Sophie had lost. A child psychologist, in her final report to the court, had written, "These children spent most of their lives learning not to trust their own bodies. Rebuilding that trust will take years, perhaps decades." The system, in this case too, had not functioned flawlessly, but at least, going forward, it might catch the next case a little sooner. A year later, a local newspaper reported on a school race Caleb had participated in, a 9-year-old boy running toward a finish line on his own 2 feet for the first time. When asked by the reporter, Caleb had smiled and said one simple sentence, "Now when I'm tired, I'm actually tired, and that's a really good feeling." Sophie's recovery progressed more slowly than her brother's. Therapists believed this was because she had begun questioning her own reality at a younger age. But at the end of the school year, her teacher sent a brief note home. Today, in class, Sophie described her favorite food without any hesitation at all. It might seem small, but for us, it was a big step. In this case, no one was entirely a monster, and no one was entirely innocent. A mother passed the wound of her own childhood on to her own children. A father, through his silence, allowed that wound to grow. A community believed a suffering child's story so easily that it forgot to ask for the truth, and a system could only see once a camera was finally turned on. In the first part, you saw how one camera exposed a single truth. In this part, you watched how a second camera revealed an entire family in which, in truth, no one was innocent. Perhaps the most vital lesson of this story was this: the truth can never be fully seen from a single vantage point. Sometimes, seeing it requires more than one pair of eyes and more than one act of courage. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this case was that no single character fit neatly into a classic story of villainy. Renee was not a monster, but her actions left the marks a monster would leave. Peter was not an accomplice, but his silence was indistinguishable from one. The system bore no malice, but its blindness swallowed 9 years of a child's life. And you who have listened to this story, must now ask your own conscience: when does love turn into a form of control? And when we believe in a hero story around us, when should we stop and ask what we are truly looking at? Perhaps the answer lies not in the story itself, but in the single voice, a nurse, a nanny, a laboratory technician, that dared to break the silence and question it. Years later, this case would continue to be taught in law schools as the Callahan case, not merely as an example of criminal law, nor merely as a case of medical ethics, but at that rare and uncomfortable point where the two intersect. And perhaps the true legacy of this case lay not in the length of the sentence handed down, but in the lesson that no one should ever again go so long without hearing a child's silent cry. The hallways of the Franklin County Courthouse have returned today to the stillness of an ordinary day. But the file of this case will remain in the archives of the state's health institutions as a warning sign. And perhaps, somewhere in another hospital room, another nurse will notice that same familiar hesitation in a child's eyes, and this time ask the question a little sooner: